Welcome back to Power Play. We want to turn to Parliament Hill and a developing story there. The federal government has just tabled legislation it says will combat online harm. They tabled that in the House of Commons just this afternoon. Arif Virani is the minister who's overseeing the file and overseeing that legislation. He joins me now. Hi, Minister. Good to have you back on the show. Thanks for making the time.
Thank you, Vassy.
The Prime Minister had initially promised that this piece of legislation would be reintroduced within 100 days of the 2021 election. That was more than 2 years ago. What is the crux of the difference in this version than the one you would have introduced two years ago?
Well, Vassy, this is really critically important legislation. It's a first of its kind in Canada, one of the first of its kind really in the world. And what I would say is that it was critical that we got it right and got the balance right. And in the intervening period, since the mandate letter first appeared with this kind of directive to pass this legislation, what we've done is consulted. We consulted widely with Canadians, with experts. We consulted internationally. We looked at what other allies, Western allies, were doing with legislation of this kind, what worked and what didn't work. We believe we found the right balance. That is a balance that is very protective of the free expression of people in a democracy, as we always need to be, but that is also a balance that protects kids fundamentally, protects vulnerable communities, and ensures that we are empowering people in terms of their interactions online and with the internet.
Was that primarily the challenge that you sought to address? Essentially, the main critique of the first iteration of this bill was that it went too far and would limit free speech. Was your objective not to do that here?
Our objective is always to empower people's expression, particularly with respect to political speech. My job as Minister of Justice is to defend people's charter rights. That is entrenched in Section 2 of the Charter. I will always do that. But I think the careful balance is that political speech is at the height of what is protected in Canada, and I will always do that. Violence and violent speech is not. And what we're seeing in Canada and around the world, frankly, is violence perpetrated against children in particular. This bill takes a very strong step in that regard. What I would say to you, Vassy, is that you know that there are seven different types of harmful content that we are targeting here. In 2 of those instances, we have said that there's no place for that content in the public discourse on the internet. That is material that sexually exploits a child, the type of child pornography that you heard at that press conference, you heard Jane speak about in terms of her own child. And secondly, content that involves the sharing of an intimate image against someone's consent, what is actually known as revenge porn. It exists in this country, it exists around the planet. We are taking active steps to ensure that material is taken down and taken down quickly. With respect to the other categories, what we are advocating for and we want to work with the platforms on is a safety plan that helps them to mitigate the risk of the other harmful content that we have identified, and that they would put in place a safety plan. They would explain what measures they're taking to reduce risk, and they would be held accountable for how well their plan is working. That's the nature of what the consultation was about. That is the pivot that we made. It's an important pivot because Canadians should understand we take this seriously. I take this seriously. We're trying to get the balance right, and I believe we've done so.
On the latter category that you were explaining there, I'm thinking, you know, as a parent and all the parents who are watching tonight, if you are worried about, for example, your kid having mental health issues and then seeing on their algorithm things that substantiate that point of view, what exactly, if it comes into effect, will this legislation do to address those concerns?
Well, I'm also a parent, Vassy, of 2 boys that now want to move from a flip phone to a smartphone. And I'm actually petrified of the dangers that lurk on the internet. And I'm also troubled by the simple fact that there are more rules and regulations about the Lego in our basement for my 2 boys than there are for the most dangerous toy in our house and the most dangerous toy in every house in this country, which is the screens that kids are on and the internet that is behind those screens. We're taking an active step to address the concerns of parents like me and grandparents who have grandchildren around the country. And what we are doing is we are entrenching a duty to protect children in legislation. We are entrenching rules which would say that when there's harmful content that includes the abuse and the sexual exploitation of a child, that material must come down. We are saying that harmful content includes material that would be used to bully a child, or material that would be used to induce a child to self-harm, to engage in acts of bulimia, or incredibly to actually commit things such as harmful acts to their body, like suicide. I think about that child in northern BC who 2 months ago was caught in one of these situations, Vassy, and had nowhere to turn to, was afraid to admit and ashamed about what had happened when he shared an intimate image. He couldn't turn to his parents, he couldn't turn to his teachers, he couldn't turn to his friends. He turned upon himself. That boy is no longer with us. That death should never have occurred, Vassy.
And
that is what we are doing with this legislation. So we're trying to keep kids like that boy in BC and so many others like him safe. Shockingly, the Centre for Canadian Child Protection told us they receive 70 complaints of sextortion every week in this country right now. And there are many more that don't have the wherewithal to reach out. We've got to be doing something, and we're doing something with this legislation.
So I'm so glad that
safe.
you raised that case, Minister, because we covered it very extensively. And I spoke to the police in that instance as well. They've actually found the individual who was the perpetrator behind that. But as you mentioned, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in the interim. Can you use that example and explain to people watching tonight what in this legislation would change the trajectory for that poor boy? Does it, you know, how will are we asking these platforms to sort of take down anything that might be involved with sextortion because, I mean, it's essentially soliciting images from these kids. It can be done on WhatsApp, which my understanding is not covered under this legislation. It can be done on DMs on Instagram, which would be covered under this legislation. Like, what today would change for that kid's ability to avoid that situation?
So a few things change. Internet platforms, including social media platforms, have a duty to protect children like that. They have a duty to take down content like that the second it is flagged or complained about. Those are critical features. We are also ensuring that people can be prosecuted for this kind of action, which means that there's something called the Mandatory Reporting Act. We've heard from law enforcement that they want better tools to ensure that they can prosecute these kinds of individuals. We're extending the preservation period, so social media platforms would be required to hold on to this material for a longer period of time. We're extending the amount of time for which a charge and a prosecution could be commenced by police officers. That is also critical. We are also ensuring that if that kind of intimidation tactic ever entered the public sphere in a public forum, that kind of bullying would be treated as harmful content and could also be flagged by the platform. So there are many steps that we are taking in the absolute right direction to ensure that kids need to be protected and will be protected with this statute.
So these platforms don't exactly have the best track record on regulating themselves. I understand there will be some accountability mechanisms as laid out in this legislation. How much teeth will they have? There's the establishment of a commission, for example. Will there be a substantial budget behind that commission? What will the budget be? How many sort of powers will they have to seek the accountability that is absent from self-regulation?
So what I'd say to you, Vassy, is that I've got a lot of respect for these companies and for the critical role they play as an educative function, et cetera. I mean, the internet can be a powerful tool for empowering people. Internet companies and social media companies also have a lot of responsibility. And what I would say to them quite clearly is that we want to work with them clearly, and we want to ensure that the message is clear, that their profit imperatives that are driven by advertising revenue cannot trump the safety of Canadians. And that is what is happening right now. That balance has to change. In terms of the teeth you're asking about, if there is a safety plan put in place, and if the efforts to improve Canadian safety are not being fulfilled pursuant to those very safety plans, there will be consequences. And the consequences are very, very significant. In terms of dollar amounts, they are 6% of the global revenue of an entity like Meta or Facebook, or $10 million, whichever is higher. That is a very significant financial consequence and financial incentives for these platforms to get on board with what we are saying and what many other governments around the planet are saying, that there needs to be accountability for keeping children safe online. There needs to be accountability for keeping Canadians safe online. It is critical with respect to all 7 categories of harmful content that we are identifying in this bill.
The primary, though, mechanism for that accountability, I would imagine that figures out if those fines are warranted or not, though, is this Digital Safety Commission. Will it have a big budget? Will it be financed by your government in order to, I mean, the breadth of the scope of these companies is massive. The instances of this kind of thing they're not small. They're not few in number, I should say.
They are not few in number. And in creating a digital safety commission, we're also creating a digital ombudsperson and a digital safety office. We're creating a dedicated entity that will deal with this material in the online sphere, and we will ensure that it has the tools to succeed and the resources to succeed. It is critical. But importantly for Canadians, it is also important that that entity is at arm's length for government. The person who is the digital safety commissioner will be decided on a motion in the House of Commons and in the Senate. It is critical for Canadians to know that that entity exists, that it has the expertise, that it is well-resourced, but also that it is objective, since it is dealing with such important issues about our freedom of expression online.
And I do take your point on that, Minister, but to what degree will it be well-resourced? Have you outlined any kind of budget for it, or you're just insisting that they will have the money they need?
My goal right now is, in tabling this legislation, is starting an important parliamentary conversation about the nature of what we are proposing, about the tools which we are also adding. We haven't had a chance to speak about it, but amendments to the Canadian Human Rights Act, amendments to the Criminal Code that deal with the pressing need to address hatred in our country. These are all fundamental features that we want to see proclaimed into law, and we want to see, once this Digital Safety Commission is proclaimed into law, that it is well-resourced, and we will ensure and prioritize that it will be.
Just before I let you go, Minister, I did want to ask about S210 and IDing kids, IDs for kids on pornography sites. The Prime Minister has vocalized opposition to that based on stuff that isn't actually in the bill, this idea of a digital ID, for example. Why is your government opposed to this, since it doesn't stipulate that kind of thing?
So I've got a lot of respect for what the senator who proposed that bill is initiating, and I think in terms of the objectives, what we're seeking to do, we have very similar objectives. What I would say is that the bill which we tabled today, the online safety legislation, is much more comprehensive in terms of its scope, its breadth, and its potential impact. What she's trying to do with that legislation is address the acute issue of child pornography. That is a concern for us. That's why you see such targeted measures that address child sex exploitation, including the complementary pieces about law enforcement that I mentioned with the Mandatory Reporting Act. We are exactly on the same page in that regard. Where we are differing on is how you ensure age-appropriate verification and age-appropriate design so that we are keeping people safe. To go back to that example, Vassy, I think Canadian parents are concerned about the screens, but also Canadian parents would never tolerate a sexual predator near the playground of their child's school, nor a sexual predator potentially calling up their home at midnight to reach out to their child. Through the internet, that is happening right now in an unregulated manner. That is what will change with this legislation. We will keep those kids top of mind, and we will keep them safe. And that's fundamental for all of us.
Just to follow up and respectfully challenge you, Minister, I don't understand what is so egregious about having kids under the age of 18, not access those porn sites. Because the bill that you're saying, that you're referencing, this one in the Senate, it doesn't say exactly how that gets done, right? Just like some parts of your bill, that's TBD, to be determined at a later point. They're just simply saying, the bill is simply saying, and 15, I believe, Liberals voted in favor of it initially, it's simply saying that kids under 18 shouldn't be accessing them.
And what I would say to you, Vassy, is that, again, with respect to Bill 210 and what we're presenting as a large package, a comprehensive package, there is the same objective in mind. We're trying to keep kids safe, trying to reduce their exploitation, trying to ensure the intimate sharing of images that are not in consent is excluded. It is critical, but there are a host of other measures that are included in our legislation that deal with terrorism, incitements to violence, hatred, bullying, intimidating a child, ensuring that they're not induced to self-harm. Our package that we're proposing has many of the features of Bill S210 and many features that complement the goals of S210. What we've put forward is a comprehensive package, and I look forward to having it discussed on the floor of the chamber and in committee to ensure how we can deal with the age-appropriate design features that both the senator who initiated that bill and I want to see to keep Canadian children safe.
Just very quickly, what's the harm in supporting both?
The issue, Vassy, is that we have a bill that is before the chamber right now that is much more comprehensive in terms of its scope. And what we have is the ability to get behind a bill that will keep Canadians safe, Canadian children safe, and ensure a duty to take down content within a 24-hour time period. There are features in this legislation that are not in Bill S210. There is no takedown provision in Bill S210 that deals with specifically the idea that child sexual exploitation material that is used to degrade children, to target children, that is used by sexual predators and pedophiles in this country, that material has no business being in Canadian society. We will ensure that that comes down and comes down promptly.
Minister, I'll leave it there. I appreciate your time today very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Vassy.
That's Justice Minister Arif Virani. He oversees the legislation that was tabled in the House of Commons today aimed at combating online harm.